From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. Joined with Nigel Palmer. Nigel is the author of the Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments, a book that we carry in the bookstore, and an expert in sustainable agriculture. Nigel, thanks for joining us. What are you working on in the garden right now?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here. And I hesitate to use the word expert. I don't consider myself an expert, but I do consider myself an experimental gardener. And what am I up to right now? Let's see. It's fall here in New England. I live in southern New England and Connecticut, so the potatoes are in. I'm just getting my shell beans off the vine and drying them out. I've got to plant my garlic soon. I'm a little bit behind the 8 ball there. The leaves are falling off the trees, so I'm shredding my leaves and putting them on my garden. Let's see what else. The fresh fruit season is just about to end. We have copious quantities of raspberries, and the pears are still alive, but that fresh fruit season is coming to an end.
Yeah. What have you guys had a couple frosts yet?
We had 2 minor frosts, and we had 2 frosts where temperatures were in the 26-degree range. And nowadays that takes out most of the herbs that we grow and some of the more delicate plants. But my tomatoes, for instance, they're still able to tolerate those colds at least a few times. So my tomatoes are still happening, but they're not long. And let's see, that's just ripening up the carrots. The carrots and the leeks are getting sweeter and sweeter. It's been a great year for both of those.
So let's go back a little bit about your background. How do you describe your journey to this spot?
Oh, geez, Zooks. Let's see. Well, it all started when I was 10. No, maybe 20. I've always had a garden, right? I mean, gardening is just something that many of us just did for fun. And I consider myself a classic gardener, organic by neglect, if you will. I would never buy anything in the store. There's no way I'd go to that wall of chemicals for either fertilizers or whatever kills anything. I'd never do that. And back in the day, cow manure and rototilling the garden was pretty well the norm. And we grew some pretty good food that way. It tasted really great. As we got older, had children, the children loved the garden. It was a great way to introduce children to where their food comes from. And then when we were in our 40s, Joan and I recognized that finding really high quality food was really difficult. It got harder and harder to do. And so we really started turning to the garden in a way to grow the food that we ate. And we focused on things that we like to grow, that we could grow a year's supply of. And it started off with garlic and potatoes, and off we went. But in doing so, it became clear that we needed some sort of fertility program in order to improve, to regenerate the soil, if you will. And we wanted to do it in a sustainable manner. And so this led me to start looking into indigenous cultures of the past and how they did it. I mean, people have been growing food for thousands of years without going to box stores. And so how did they do it? And, it starts off with putting weeds in a bucket of rainwater and letting it rot. And boy, the plants certainly seemed to like it. I mean, it smelled god awful after a couple of weeks, and it was barely tolerable, but, plants seemed to like it. And then it's like, well, there's got to be something else going on here. And actually, it was Acres USA that introduced me to John Kempf. Actually, Dan dragged me down there with his mother and Derek Christensen, and we came to Acres and we listened to John speak. And boy, that just sent me off into the stratosphere. And I think it was a year later, I actually bought a book, Natural Farming, at the Acres USA bookstore. And I opened this little tiny book up, and I saw in there were recipes for how to make fermented plant juices and how to make vinegar extractions and how to make IMO 1, 2, 3, 4 and herbal nutrients and all of these amazing things. And it just opened up a door for me that was just fantastic. And after several years of doing these things and recognizing how well they worked and how sustainable and regenerative they were, it became clear that this was a thing to do. And my wife started a school and asked me to teach the gardening section of that. And in the process of putting together curriculum for that, I recognized that I had acquired and amassed a pretty nice recipe book. And so I thought that this information was so hard to gather, it needs to be published so that anybody in the world can grab hold of a recipe book and actually make these things. And the other part of it was recognizing that in agriculture, when we have conversations in agriculture, one of the difficulties is we don't come it from a common place. We all have notions about agriculture, and I felt it was really important to put together what I call a plant soil model. In other words, an understanding of the interrelationships between plants and soil and how it all works so that we could have a conversation about the effects of our actions in the garden or on the farm. And so I wrote up a beginning portion with a plant model to go in the front of this recipe book, and off that went. And let's see, I was an aerospace engineer for 36 years, solving very complex problems in airplanes, if you will. And that system approach to complex problems has helped me tremendously in trying to navigate the plant soil model and the interaction between plants and soil in order to put them into a context that we can discuss and all work from in order to have conversations about regenerativeness, for instance, or sustainability, or the effects of our actions, and recognizing that every time we go into an agricultural environment and do something, it is an intervention and it disrupts the system. And we need to understand the ramifications of that disruption so that we can weigh the cost benefit analysis of those actions.
I think people listening to the podcast will almost get tired of me saying it, but it is shocking how many folks in our world here have engineering backgrounds. And it's not, I guess it's shocking. It just seems to be such a translator to this type of farming because it's such a problem solving, solution based method.
Yeah, I think farmers are some of the best engineers in the world. I mean, collectively, when you look at the skill set of a farmer, it is so vast and is required to be vast. I think the farmers of our world are natural engineers and are put in a situation where they constantly have to solve very complex problems, and sometimes, in some cases, very quickly.
Yeah. What was some of the first things that you noticed that started working? I know you mentioned putting weeds into a bucket with water, but what
Yeah.
are some of the things that really started, intensifying this recipe book and things that really connected the dots for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the single most commentary, if I had to pick an overall discussion, I mean, there's all kinds of nuances and anecdotes and things like that, but I think the overall thing was the fundamental change in the ecosystem at large. And in other words, let's see. Animal cycles, the cycle of populations is a chaotic function. In other words, they can be really big, really small, very quickly, and it's relatively unclear what causes these things. Perhaps people recognize the wings of the butterfly causing the tsunami kind of conversation. Well, in looking at populations in my garden space, in fact, my lawn, my land, I noticed that populations would come and go, but they all move towards a stability in diversity. And I think this is something that a lot of people recognize. Many people have written about it. But for me, it's all of a sudden I've got toads, I've got snakes, I've got frogs, I've got voles, I've got moles. And then now I've got hawks and I've got different kind of hawks, sharp-shinned hawks. I've got red tails and broadwing. These birds, they sit in my lawn, and this has become a place to have breakfast, for heaven's sakes, for these guys. And so it's this change in the ecological system from something that was relatively sterile when I started off. I live at 1,000 feet in Connecticut, which is a relatively high elevation. I'm out of the river valley. And so the land that I have is essentially volcanic, not volcanic, it's a moraine from the Ice Age. 10,000 years ago, the ice dumped all the soil that I got here, and not much has changed for the last 10,000 years. And so it was fairly barren when we first moved in here. But I mean, even like little red newts, I see them in my garden now. I run my lawnmower, and the toads and the frogs are jumping out of the way. The worm population is increasing. The vole population comes and goes. All of a sudden, I'll have a year of tremendous voles, and then they settle down, and then it's squirrels, and then so I'm seeing this chaotic natural phenomena of the variety of ecosystem that changes naturally as populations come, populations go, and everything kind of begins to settle out into a lovely, lovely equilibrium.
Yeah. It's almost like nature knows.
Almost like that, right? I mean, nature's
Yeah.
obviously the best teacher for all of us. I mean, those of us, I think, that are involved in the type of thinking and learning that you are putting forward in Acres, I think that we all recognize that nature is by far the best teacher, and all we've got to do is open our eyes and start paying attention to what's going on around us.
So what has changed since you started teaching these subjects? Because I think teaching always turns people into a higher level executor and understanding of what's going around them. So what have you learned since you started teaching these things?
Yeah, that's a really fun question for me. I haven't really sat and thought about that for some time now, but it certainly is an evolution. And for me, one of the best ways to learn is to teach. And as I've taught this and gotten more and more into the weeds, I'll say, about these topics and a better understanding, I think the thing that is really fun for me is the solidification, and I use that word sparingly, but the solidification of a fundamental understanding of the complexity of the system that we're trying to manipulate. And within that context, there's a simplicity that goes along with it, i.e., our actions, right? What are we going to do in this system? It becomes simpler and simpler to operate and recognize what's going to work and what's not going to work in that system, but also recognizing how complex that system might be. So I think it's this movement towards, and first of all, it's a desire to understand the system and be able to explain it in terms that most people can understand, including myself for that matter. And then recognizing that once there's an understanding of the system, then conversations about the system and conversations about positive effects and negative effects, and I'm going to go back to regenerative and sustainability again, become far clearer. And so one of my goals in the process is not so much telling people what to do, because in every single ecological agricultural environment, everything is different. What suits me here is entirely different than what's going to suit somebody at a different elevation or down the street or a different crop or whatever it might be. But there's certain foundational ideas that we all need to understand so that we can have context to understand why it is that this system works or isn't working or whatever it might be.
So you'll be doing a full day workshop at Acres at our conference, and you'll have a presentation throughout the general conference. What are the foundational concepts that you're going to be covering in the workshop and that you've
Yeah,
discovered now? What's the core concepts in your teachings?
that's great. So there's three stools, four stools, pick a number of legs to the agricultural environment. But first of all, there's minerals, then there's biology, and then there's organic matter. And then there is the voltage and acidity within the environment, within the entire ecosystem, by the way, inside your own body as well, within which everything needs to have in order to survive. whether you're a bacteria, fungi, whether you're a virus, whether you're a plant, whether you're a human being, all of us, all of the life exists within certain voltage and acidity conditions. And these are basically going to define who lives and who dies. So I want to talk about minerals and a little bit about minerals and how they flow, right? They're all ionic. When we talk about minerals in the soil, we're talking about ions. We're talking about cations and anions. Well, those are charged. That means they are going to move within a voltage. Then there's a voltage in the plant. There's a voltage in human beings. There's voltage everywhere within which actually dictates who wants to go where. And if you want to go upstream from that voltage, then you got to figure out how. And so I want to talk about all of these ideas and form an understanding of the complexity of the system, how the minerals are digested by the biology, how the biology takes that food that the plant gives them and breaks down organic matter, how that organic matter is structured and layered is actually a distribution of different organic matter within soil that creates soil. And it's these places that have the places for biology to hide and to hunt, to hold water, and all of the lovely things that the organic matter provides us. And within this ecosystem, we now have plants actually providing energy, actually creating voltages and acidities in various locations that allow different things to survive or die. And this is how plants have survived for 400 million years. And so I hope to explain this in a way that people can understand it. And now with that knowledge, now we can talk about a scorecard for regenerative or sustainability. Now we can talk about composting and how organic matter breaks down and how to increase the organic matter in your soil and why in some cases the organic matter doesn't increase even though you're adding organic matter. And then finally talk about what are some of the biological and mineral amendments that are available to us that we can actually put on our fields or our gardens to minimize the plant energy loss. This is the key. Anything that we do, all interventions that we put forward into an agricultural environment, they require plant energy to bring them back into a balance. And so the plant is using energy to fix all the things that we do rather than growing more leaves for photosynthesis, for instance. And so within that context, we can talk about what amendments might be better than others. And then finally, we'll actually do some hands-on where we'll make fermented plant juices and we'll make vinegar extractions. And I will share the analysis of these products that I've done over the years and show all 18 of the minerals that are needed are in there. And they're in plant proportions. And they're available to the plant immediately. And this is why they work so well. The whole homeopathy idea of these small trace minerals available, they work because they're already in the form that the plant needs in order to use them. The plant doesn't have to digest the 10-10-10. The plant doesn't have to eliminate and get over the fungicide or herbicide. The plant doesn't have to rebuild the soil because it's been tilled. And so it's an efficiency thing. So I hope to go through all of that and then answer people's questions. And I'm really hopeful that people will have a context for evaluating their actions within their fields.
What's some of the, you want to dive into the fermentation process and how you came about developing those products and how folks can do that at home?
Yeah, so for me, it was that natural farming book that turned me on to it all. People refer to it as Korean natural farming. And the other thing, when I read about fermented plant juices, it was just such an intuitive moment. When we talk about feeding a tomato, what is the best thing to feed a tomato? And it became very clear that that tomato at the end of the season is the quintessential effort of the tomato plant. And to be able to ferment that tomato and actually use that juice to feed tomatoes the following year was just such an intuitively obvious thing. And of course, being an engineer, I wanted to analyze that fermented plant juice of tomato, and I did. And I analyzed it, and I was blown away by seeing the diversity of minerals that were in it, the proportions of the minerals that were in it, and recognizing this is what a tomato does, wants, needs, etc. And so the whole idea of feeding a tomato plant, the fermented plant juice of a tomato was just such an obvious duh that it really just sparked my interest. The other thing that was fascinating about it, as I continued to do analysis of fruits and vegetables, was recognizing that this is where we get our minerals, right? Those constituents that I was analyzing and seeing in my analysis, it suddenly dawned on me, this is why I eat a tomato. This is why I eat an apple, because this is where I'm getting those minerals. And they're in the form that I can use directly rather than taking a supplement or whatever it might be. And so this whole idea of using these very simple ideas in order to feed plants became really, really not only powerful, but also intuitively obvious, but it was empowering. It's the recognition that we have the tools in our own front yard, backyard, right over there, that we can use to really grow high-end fruits and vegetables.
So what are the steps? What are the steps to fermenting tomatoes? How do you save them throughout the year, and then how do you apply it?
Well, so that's just it, this is just so great. I argue that you can make a fermented plant juice in less time than it takes most people to get in the car, go to drive to the box store, buy whatever it is that they think that they need, and then bring it back. And so the recipe is very simple. You take your tomatoes and you mix them with organic brown sugar at equal proportions by weight, and you put it in a jar and you let it sit for a week, and then you strain it. That's it. That's it. It's that simple. And what's really amazing is, let's say I make a quart of this fermented plant juice of tomatoes. So we're going to dilute that 500 or 1,000 to 1. So at 500 to 1, that quart is 500 quarts. That's 125 gallons. And so when we talk about scaling, which is often something that people get hung up about, if I have a 2,000 acre farm, well, if I've got a tote of a couple hundred gallons and I make a couple hundred gallons of this stuff, I'm really going to use 500 times that. And so it's very, very easy to see how these products can be made at scale for anybody. And then once people recognize how well they work, of course, depending on the soil and the environment that you're using them in, it becomes a no-brainer. And also, we'll go through some cost numbers too. I have a chart where we talk about cost numbers for making these things as well.
So when do you apply it?
So
Is there
that's a
certain
really fun.
timing?
Yeah, timing is always a good thing. Uh, on 32,000 feet, applying them in the morning is a really great idea because there's moisture on the leaves, and so everything's damp, and the plant is actually doing some absorption of those minerals at that time. So a foliar spray in the morning would be a very good idea. The bottom line is just do it. Do it's better than not. And I'm reminded of an experiment that Kerry Reams did years and years ago, where I may get the numbers and the amounts wrong here, but you're going to get the principle. Whereas he applied a foliar spray to a bean plant. And I don't know if it was every minute or every 30 seconds or whatever he did. He did it very quickly. And he managed to have a bean go from seed to full maturity in a period of about a month or several 20 days or something like that. I don't remember the actual numbers, but you get the idea. And what this does is it gives us notions about the growth of plants. Plants don't grow necessarily on a time scale that we live in. They really grow on a time scale of the nutrition that's available to them. And so by providing plants with nutrition that they need at that time, we can considerably increase the efficacy of maturation, but also the quality of the fruits that finally comes off of those plants. So it's a lovely concept, and it gives one an inkling as to what might be possible.
Do you apply daily? Is it weekly? When do you decide, or how often do you put the application on?
Well, so when I had to work for a living and
Yeah.
do all the other stuff that happened around here, I did not foliar spray as often as I do when I became retired. and had more time. So I have my daily pattern is I wake up and I go outside. The first thing I do is go outside and I measure soil temperatures and air temperatures, and I do all sorts of silly things like that. And in the process of doing that, I walk around my gardens and I see what's happening and say hello and all the stuff. And I have gotten into the habit of picking a plant or picking a foliar spray that I might apply on that particular day. So one day I might have a fermented plant juice of potato, and I would foliar spray my potato plants. And I might consider what else to spray that fermented plant juice of potato. And this brings up a whole nother conversation about using foliar sprays of different plant type on different plant types. And for instance, I found that some plants, they don't like fermented plant juice of potato at all, right? And then I found that some, like carrots, fermented plant juice of carrot tops seems to be something that's liked by a far bigger group of plants. So, and then the next morning I might do carrots, fermented plant juice of carrots, or fermented plant juice of Brussels sprouts, or whatever it is. So, what I'm trying to do these days is to be in the habit of doing it and to pick different foliar sprays. It might be a vinegar extraction of cow bones, for instance, if I'm really looking for that phosphorus and I want to promote the flowering of a vegetable or something like that. Whereas I might use a vinegar extraction of oyster shells if I'm looking for that big calcium product. And by doing the analysis, by seeing what's in front of me, you get ideas of what is actually in some of these things, specifically vinegar extractions, that you can use to affect the phases of influence of a plant. And also in different processes, I found ways to increase the concentration of certain minerals by multiple extractions and some other methods like that.
What's your working theory on what do you think is in the carrots that makes it be able to, go to the other plants and they accept it?
That's a really fun question. Um, I haven't really thought about a theory of why that specific plant works, but carrot tops, I mean, when you think about carrot tops, they're extremely efficient photosynthesizers. And there's also just such a wonderful spectrum of minerals in them. It's kind of like stinging nettle. Stinging nettle is a fermented plant juice that I would use on just about anything. It just has such a lovely content. If you look at the mineral content on the analysis of a stinging nettle plant, it's really, really broad and it's really, really high in many of the minerals that are there. And that has a lot to do with the soils it grows in and its characteristics in general. And I think carrots are maybe similar in that they have not only good concentrations, but also concentrations of a lot of different minerals. And I've done that analysis, and all that analysis is available on my website. It's all free. It's there for anybody to look at and review and get some ideas of what's going on. So I think the first thing I'd say about carrots is they have a wonderful complement of minerals of the right proportions that will affect a large variety of plants. And that may be simply the right concentrations of minerals that promotes photosynthesis, for instance.
Stinging nettles. I watched a video of you on your YouTube page of you stripping stinging nettles with your hands. What are you just immune to it, or is it something that at certain stages that you try to use the nettles at?
Well, this might seem a little esoteric, but and anybody can try this. If you approach stinging nettle with intent, it will not bother you. She will leave you
I
alone.
actually believe that because during the spring, the first couple days, because I always walk around our pastures with shorts on, and my
Yep.
legs will burn from them. But after a few days of it, they don't seem to bother me anymore.
They don't bother you. Stinging nettle, I've had a relationship with stinging nettle for many years. It's a lovely tea. It's an amazing nutritive. I harvest the buds in the springtime and dehydrate them for tea all year long. It's a wonderful weed for making a fermented plant juice. I use it as a mulch. I use it. I always have a stand of it available. And when I approach it, she doesn't bother me. And if she does sting me, it's very light. I mean, in that video, I mean, I was living in it there, and it didn't
Yeah,
bother me. Um, there are times, though, if I'm in the garden and I just brush up against her, nonchalant, sometimes I'll get stung fairly significantly. But in the sting is therapeutic. I don't know if that sounds weird, but I don't mind it. It's something that,
Yeah.
especially on my hands, I'm old and my hands don't work as well as they used to, and the sting on my hands doesn't bother me.
Hi there. Just wanted to interrupt this episode to make sure that you have heard about our Acres 2024 Eco Egg Conference. This year's event will be held in Madison, Wisconsin from December 2nd through December 5th. I think we have put together one of the best lineups for a conference in the regenerative and organic agriculture space. Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and their team from Understanding Ag, along with Joel Salton, John Kemp, Gary Zimmer, Mark Shepard, Dr. Nasha Winters, Megan Neubauer, Matt Powers, Nigel Palmer, Will Harris, Jeff Poppin, Aaron Silva, Austin Unruh, Andre Liu, Jay Fuhrer, Steve Diver, and many more. So if you're interested, feel free to give us a call at 970-392-4464 or email us at support@acresusa.com. You can also register online at acresusa.com/eco-ag. What's the importance? You had mentioned using nails for mulch. I'm assuming a lot of the mulching practices that you have is rooted in building organic matter. What's some of the important keys of building organic matter in your soil?
Well, building organic matter is something that I've been focusing on for a few years now, and it first came to light when I started making significant compost piles of size, recognizing I just couldn't make enough of the stuff, and and I make a compost pile, and 2/3 of it disappears. It's like, okay, so what's going on here, and how do you actually build organic matter? And I hope to cover some of this in my program. But we talk about the carbon nitrogen ratio, and that's pretty well understood. And okay, so you need 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen in order to break even in mineralization. But the next thing that came to light was some papers that Olivier Husson pointed me to. And these researchers are recognizing stoichiometry in composting. And I know it's a big word, and I'll try and explain that. One of the things that last year at Acres, I had the privilege of hearing David Johnson and Sue talk about the bioreactor. And one of the things that he said that really struck me was the analysis of the compost that's made in the bioreactor in Arizona or New Mexico, in that part of the world, had the same chemical constituency as the organic matter that was made in the bioreactor in New Zealand. And this is something that I've heard several times. Harriet Mella also made these comments on some podcasts that she did with John, and talking about how fully degraded compost all has the same relative chemical structure. And so when I talk about stoichiometry, I'm talking about the two H's plus an oxygen equals H2O. So there's a certain balance, there's a math that goes along with chemistry. And that's an example. These chemical equations are the stoichiometry that I'm referring to. Well, it turns out that not only is the carbon nitrogen ratio important in the development of organic matter, but it's the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur ratio that research papers have showed are also responsible and important in making compost. And so when these things finally break down, it's my assertion that not only those four minerals, but all of the minerals are in specific proportions. And this is why in making a compost pile, one needs to consider not only the carbon nitrogen ratio, not only the clay aggregate that's important to making humic substances, but also recognizing that the phosphorus and the sulfur need to be in balance, and that the other minerals in building up compost piles need to be in balance as well. And this brings up the conversation of priming. And priming is something that maybe many of your listeners may or may not have heard about. But the idea is that if these ratios don't exist in the breaking down of organic matter, then the biology is going to go and find those minerals. Remember, biology doesn't watch TV, take vacations, or anything like that. It has a certain path and it's going down that path. And so when we put organic matter on our fields and we do not have this balance, then the biology is going to go to the existing organic matter and break it down to find those minerals. And this is why some people may be adding organic matter, but they're not building organic matter because these stoichiometry relationships aren't happening. And so this is something that I'd like to talk about and try and bring to people's attentions in an effort to try and enhance our abilities to build organic matter.
Do you want to describe your process in making your compost to make sure that you have those key pieces in it? Like, how do you add phosphorus? How do you add sulfur?
Exactly. And this is when I first started learning about minerals, and I started learning about, you need half a part per million of cobalt and half a part per million of molybdenum, and all of these, 3 parts per million, 2 parts per million boron. I was stymied. Where am I going to go and where am I going to do that? Where am I going to find cobalt that isn't mined in South Africa under terrible conditions and shipped? And where am I going to find phosphorus? We know we have a limited supply of phosphorus, right? If they say it might run out in 2050, pick a number. I don't know what it is. And then so how do you do this? Back to the word sustainably. And when I started doing analysis on the vinegar extractions and the fermented plant juices of the things in my backyard, they had phosphorus in it. They had cobalt in it, and they had it in the proportion that was appropriate for plants. And so all of a sudden, I recognized that I have sources for these things now. And so when it comes to bulk items like calcium, for instance, where am I going to find calcium? Well, those cow bones have an awful lot of calcium in it. By the way, they also have balances of all the other minerals as well. So cow bones becomes a tremendous important part of any kind of composting. Fish from the ocean have a tremendous balance of minerals in them that can be used in the compost system. Seaweed is another example. And then when I'm looking for those trace minerals, if I don't happen to have those things, then it becomes clear that the fermented plant juices and the vinegar extractions that I'm making do have them in them. So I'm actually going to add those things to my compost pile as well. So I'm sure I'm getting balanced mineral proportions to not only my garden, but also, and not only my plants, but also my compost pile. And then the other thing
Yeah.
that's in compost that a lot of people may or may not recognize is the need for clay. And clay is an absolute important part of the aggregate structure. We need clay. And so I like to add a rock dust that's really, really fine in order to get the clay that I need in my compost pile. And for that is one of the things that I actually do purchase, and that's gypsum from a real mine, not the packaged processed gypsum. And that gives me the sulfur that I need, as well as the clay and some calcium. The other source of sulfur that's really valuable in composting that people might think about is sheep's wool. Curly hair has a lot of sulfur in it. And so sheep's wool is tremendous source of sulfur for composting in other environments where sulfur is needed. And I remember telling some people this, and it was somebody, I can't remember who it was, but pointed out to me in a beauty salon, the place smells like eggs. And the reason for that is getting that sulfur and curling hair. And so it's curly hair that has sulfur in it. So it's learning about what resources are in your backyard to satisfy the agricultural needs of plants and ourselves and making sure that they're in forms that are balanced and that can be used effectively.
Yeah. Do you want to discuss? You had mentioned soil voltage earlier. Do you want to give kind of an overview of how you use soil voltage? What is it, and what people could look for?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And when I first started looking into voltage and acidity of soils, the first thing I thought of was, so what? Why would I take my time and energy? Why would I take your time and energy and talk about soil and voltage if there wasn't a reason to actually use it? And how does this notion of a certain bacteria or biology requiring a voltage and acidity range in order to survive? And So the first thing was learning about it and understanding it. And then the second thing is, well, who cares, right? And the answer is this. Once we recognize that that all bacteria, fungi, viruses, insects, plants require voltage and acidity ranges, and once we look at the work of Olivier Houssin, who has mapped this out, which we'll be presenting, and showing that there's a certain range that voltage and acidity is required for plants, and recognizing that both natural and human interventions are going to move the system into areas that are desirable for insects and for bacteria, fungi, and viruses. By recognizing that our actions are actually changing the voltage and acidity of the environment to away from where plants want to be, and this is why insect pressure occurs. This is why bacteria and fungal problems occur, because we've actually changed the environment to a different range of voltage and acidity that the plant no longer desires as optimal, but more importantly, to an area where the pathogens that are our problem want to exist. And then we start learning about the different ways that plants combat this situation by by exuding superoxides into this environment, so that the voltage and acidity goes way past what they're used to, but also way past what the insects and the bacteria are used to, and they can't survive. And then we quickly recognize that the entire ecosystem is nothing more than a fight for survival, for controlling the voltage and acidity in the soil. And so I want to present these ideas so that we can now have a conversation about what is the effect of tilling. Oh, well, it's going to greatly oxidize the soil. It moves the voltage and acidity into this range, which is going to promote the viruses and funguses and the bacteria and the insect pressure that is going to do damage to your plants. And Olivier has actually mapped these things, and we'll talk about this and show this data. And so the reason that it's important to understand is this gives cause and effect to some of the problems that we have in our field. And then we can talk about, well, how do we stabilize the situation? How do we build an environmental situation that is going to be robust and be able to tolerate as best possible the interventions, both the natural interventions and the human interventions? And we quickly learn that is building organic matter, having a huge, stable organic matter, and then also by having a diverse biological community, which is essentially the toolbox that plants can use to alter and control these environments.
Yeah, that's I'm sure all of these pieces are how you develop the scorecard and how you assess these different practices. How have you? I guess let's talk a little bit about how you develop this scorecard, how people are using it, how you use it in your operation.
Well, for me in my operation, it's really easy. I don't need a scorecard because I don't buy any of the poisons that are manufactured. I don't buy any of that. I never have. I mean, I literally never have. And so I recognize that that's not a problem. What is more of an issue is how I treat the soil. And this, now you got the idea of no-till and all of those sorts of things. And so I minimize that. And let's be clear, in a real agricultural environment, there's no A and B. There's no do this and don't do that. Everything is a continuum. And this is another thing that I really want to talk about is the idea of gradients. There's nothing that's stable. There's nothing that's homogeneous in life. Everything changes all the time, whether it's humidity, whether it's temperature, whether it's pressure, whether it's voltage, whether it's acidity, whether it's concentration. All of these things change all the time. And so what I've learned is to try and minimize those changes, right? It's that simple. This is the whole point. The more I learn that doing the right thing is really simple. And this is the thing that I'd like to try and convey. So minimizing those disruptions is really important. Maximizing the organic matter in your soil is really important. Learning that the soil needs a constant supply of organic matter to feed the biology in the active layer up on the top of the surface, but also all of that is going to filter down and make smaller and smaller and more stable aggregate structures until down in the lower layers, that's where the fulvic acids and the humic substances, humus and human and things like that are actually going to exist. And so recognizing that we need a constant supply of those organic matters, and recognizing that when we disrupt the soil, we're causing damage, and recognizing that as the organic matter increases, we're creating a buffer for all of these things.
What do you think some of the challenges, with you teaching classes now and workshops, and since you've written your book, what's some of the feedback you're getting with people? What are the things that they're having challenges with, or maybe not quite connecting the dots?
That's a really fun question. The easy answer is I don't know, because everybody's different. Everybody approaches this problem from a different place. I think the fundamental issue is the same issue that I had when I started learning these things. And that was holy cow, this makes entirely intuitive sense. No kidding, right? And that's the aha moment. And I think a lot of people get the aha moment. They're going to get the intuitive nature of things, the intuitive nature of the conversation. And yeah, okay, this is obviously the way to go. The next thing is putting it into practice, right? And that's the hardest part. We as human beings have uh, um, ways of doing things, and that's the way we do it. And changing our behavior is really, really difficult. And I think a lot of people are daunted by change. And I think that's the biggest problem. Whether it's time, I mean, pick an average family in the United States with both people working, kids all over the place, taking them all over the place, right? Working a full-time job. Oh, by the way, would you mind coming up with something creative and interesting while you're doing all that, right? And so it's really, really hard for people to eke out the corner of the world that they can actually implement these ideas, or even more difficult, to learn more about them. And this is why I wrote this silly little book, is because I hope that it would provide the context, the model with which to remind people of the world that we really live in, and the recipes that I suggest are very, very simple, that people can invoke to actually make change. And so I think that the challenge people have is A, finding the time, B, changing their paradigm, and C, actually doing it. Not only just making these things, but also just doing it. And being being with intent. One of the problems with being so busy all the time, with all the stuff that life throws at us, is actually stopping for a minute and being intent on what you're doing and being focused on what you're doing rather than just flailing and doing it. So I think that there are huge hurdles for all of us as we march down this path. And this is one of the reasons why I think Acres is so important, is because it provides a forum. It provides a respite from the silliness of the world, where we can all sit together and talk about these ideas and exchange these ideas and leave energized with a new paradigm, a new set of tasks, some of them hopefully graspable enough to be able to accomplish in the next growing season. And as you well know, gardening, farming, we get a new canvas every year, brand new set of problems, and it's all brand new. And I love the spring because it is such a hopeful time of year. Would see those little guys popping out of the soil and things like that. And it's just a matter of embracing these ideas and doing something. What are you going to do differently this year to move towards a regenerative, sustainable idea?
It's a constant testing and observing.
You bet. You bet.
Yeah. So besides your book, I think that'd be a great thing for people to pick up and consume before they come over to your workshop. What other resources would you recommend to folks that can move down this path?
Whew, well, I'd say Acres is a great resource. That's one of the
Yeah.
recommendations that I give people. Um, as far as personally, I have a website, and I'm not a website guy. I'm not a multimedia guy. I've tried to spend time doing this stuff, but I see it as a time suck, and I may get better at it or not. But in my website, I have a data set. I have about 70 or something different analyses of fermented plant juice and vinegar extractions, fermented fish, And the data set is set up where you can do some comparing of not only products, but also multiple extractions and different types of extraction. That's all available for free. And I try and make this available to people all over the world so that they can see for themselves that this data is real, these processes are real, and the amendments, the mineral concentrations that you can get from these things are real. So that's a resource that I would offer people. The other resource that's similar to that is James Duke's database, the ethnobotanical database that he put together. It has about 2,000 different plants in it. That's also for free online. And what that does is that gives you an idea of what minerals might be in the plants that you have growing in your garden or your farm, for instance. If you have a particular weed, you might recognize that this is nature's way of bringing minerals back up to the surface and bioremediating the land that we're growing on. And you could look at the James Duke database in order to determine what minerals are actually in it. And I would suggest that if you have a weed that's prominent in your growing space, then it might be worth making a fermented plant juice out of that and just feeding it back into the soil in an effort to facilitate nature's work. Right? This is what nature's trying to do. And so this is how we can actually work with nature rather than beating it with a stick. So those are two
Yeah.
resources. I think John's stuff is a great resource. Anything that is podcasts and things like that. And in the back of my book, there's a bibliography that has all kinds of writings in it. I think that I think probably the most important resource available to people is their garden or their farm. Go out into your farm, your growing space, and just look around and be aware. And well, what is that bug? And get down on your knees and look in the soil and study the hairs on the plant and everything. Just be aware and be cognizant of what's going on in your growing space.
Be present.
Be present. You got it.
Yeah. All right, Nigel. Well, you can see Nigel's stuff. His website is nigel-palmer.com. Is there anywhere else people should look for your items at, Nigel?
I don't know. What else should I say? I'm pretty.
Well, you could probably find most of everything on the website, right?
Yeah. Oh, I guess I
Yeah.
do offer a program once a year, usually in the winter months, that seems to be a good thing for people. That's another thing that I guess I offer.
Is
And
it
of course,
in
I try
person,
to.
online?
Yeah, it's online. It's a Zoom program. That way, I can accommodate people all over the world. And I'm also trying to write articles for your magazine, and so there's another place
Yeah.
that you can find me.
Yeah. Well, you've been great help to us. I appreciate all the information that you give us. I'm looking forward to having you at the workshop. What's the last kind of pitch for people to make sure they come and attend your workshop?
I don't know. Look forward to seeing you if you care to be interested in these ideas. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Nigel, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you in December.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.